Hi, I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we explore horror and all the things that scare us. This is Season 2, Episode 9, and this is our first episode of the year 2018. So we actually thought that we would, because we're recovering from the holidays, that we would take a little bit of a detour and have just kind of a one-off episode before we begin our next major series. So today, in honor of the marathon on the Sci-Fi Channel, we are going to be discussing some of our favorite Twilight Zone episodes. Mel, what was your favorite Twilight Zone episode?
One of my favorite Twilight Zone episodes is The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. And I really enjoy that episode, I think, just because, well, one, I'm a fan of Shirley Jackson, and I think you can definitely see some of her influence on that episode. And two, because it is just so creepy, because I think it hits us where a lot of our fears really are. Because it starts out in this kind of idyllic 1950s town where everybody's washing their cars or cutting their grass or chatting on the telephone or getting ready to run errands. And then gradually over the course of the day, bizarre things start happening. They lose power, their telephones don't work, their cars stop working. And then as the day goes on, things get even weirder, where certain people's cars seem to start working again, but they don't know what's going on. And gradually we realize that there's a lot going on underneath the surface of this pleasant town. When people start accusing other people of things or saying that they know that they do strange things, like staying up all night long, watching the stars, putting together ham radios, all these sorts of things that we think of now as part of like the McCarthy scare, the idea of the scare of communism, that people who look like us and live next door to us in these peaceful, idyllic towns may actually be communicating with someone else or be a spy. And so it plays off of science fiction, but also does that really great cultural critique that Rod Serling was so good at. I don't know, have you guys seen that one? What do you guys think about it?
Well, I actually just rewatched all of the episodes we picked this morning to help prepare for this episode that we're recording. And I thought all of the same things that you thought. I didn't make the Shirley Jackson connection while I was watching it until you just said it, and I had to mute myself from saying, of course. But I very much I'm watching this going, oh, this is, you can see the Red Scare McCarthy trial sort of influence there with the hysteria of, people start looking for the monsters, essentially, and then they start finding weird things about their neighbors because they're paying too close attention to them. And I can't remember one of the main characters' names, but he basically says that yes, we're going to start looking for all of these idiosyncrasies and focusing in on them. And I think it's a great point. And I also thought too that it was, it's dated in a way because of the Red Scare, but in a lot of ways it still syncs right up with our current climate, where people are afraid of Muslims or people who are Arabic or even look Arabic because they might be terrorists. I think that same sort of fear applies where you have people who are Sikhs being thrown off airplanes because they're wearing turbans, and Sikhs are very different from Muslims if you know anything about religion at all. So that kind of hysteria and mob mentality, it's uncomfortable to watch sometimes just because of, how susceptible we really are to that sort of hysteria.
Yeah, Matt, I thought the exact same thing when I rewatched this. This was an episode, it's one of my favorites too. And so I was really excited to rewatch it. And one of the first things I wrote down when I was doing the rewatch and prep for this episode was Shirley Jackson. Mainly because of just the whole witch hunt feel to it, which is something that never, that we never outgrow that in humanity. So that's something that's always going to be relevant. And yeah, Matt, I see what you're saying with it kind of feeling a little bit dated, but at the same time, you could feel how this could be applied to something today. And what really stood out to me rewatching it that I had never noticed it before was, first, I guess I had forgotten that everything stopped working immediately. I don't know, when I was remembering it, I thought it was just a power outage. But they make the point of saying that, well, even the portable radios don't work. So even like battery powered things don't work. So it can't just be a simple power outage. There's something that alerted them right away that this wasn't a normal thing. And that struck me because I thought about how influential this episode has been in science fiction that has come after this, which I had never made that connection before. I mean, the first thing was that Revolution TV show that came out maybe 5 years or so ago, where all the power goes out, and it's not just electrical power. Nothing works if it has an on and off switch. But then the thing that really struck me was how quickly they were to turn on each other. And I know that was the point of the whole episode, is kind of watching this witch hunt evolve. But the first guy that they turn to is that character, Les Goodman, when his car starts and no one else's car is working. So obviously there's something suspicious about him. And the thing that they point to is, well, he gets up every morning and looks at the sky. And that struck me as so sinister. And that was the heart of the terror, I think, of this episode for me, is how quickly and easily the neighbors could turn on somebody for something so simple as, well, he looks to the sky. So obviously he's looking for aliens. He's waiting for his people to come back. He's waiting for the spaceships to land. But they took, and he even said, he said, well, I have insomnia. I get out, when I can't sleep, and I walk around and I look up at the sky, and it soothes me. And they turn something as simple as that. And then you start thinking how quickly people can take just innocent gestures and misconstrue them. And then, of course, things amp up really quickly in the episode when a shotgun appears. And you kind of realize how quickly things like this can turn deadly. But, immediately you start seeing, connections. We mentioned Shirley Jackson because she was really great at this fear of the outsider and neighborhoods turning on somebody that they didn't understand, but also like going back to the Salem witch trials and, the works of Hawthorne even. And, how quickly people could say, I saw her with the devil. I saw him with the devil. I saw him wearing a turban. I saw her looking up at the sky, and that terror never goes away. And so that's kind of, I think, why this is one of those timeless episodes.
Oh, I was just thinking, yeah, I mean, it really does, during the Salem witch trials, it's like, oh, the weather, you might have a year where the weather is really bad, and that sets it up, kind of like the loss of power, right? Like these things that we don't quite understand or we don't necessarily have control over, and then you, for whatever reason, like your crops don't grow or your car won't work or your cell phone won't work or whatever we think about now, that starts that kind of paranoia and that wondering and kind of wanting to protect yourself. And then it doesn't take long for those social bonds to start to fray over silly things, like you were saying, like, oh, that kid reads all these comic books, why? Or, it was popular at the time to put together your own ham radio and talk to people around the world. Well, why is he doing that at night? And why does he never talk about it? Why does he have it in his basement? And all these things are completely innocuous. People all of a sudden start seizing on them because they already feel that fear of not being able to explain why none of the things in their lives are working properly. And then as power starts coming back selectively into people's homes and the violence starts to happen, it's really fast. And I think that's one of the scariest morals of that story, is that it doesn't necessarily take an outside force coming into a small town to wreck it. It just takes confusion and manipulation, and the people hurt themselves.
Well, this episode has one of the best last few moments, I think, because you're realizing, the title of the episode is "The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street," and it is built up from the very beginning that this is the calm before the monsters come, and you kind of sort of realize really quickly that, oh, this is turning into one of those episodes where the monsters are the people. The monsters are not literal monsters coming into the street. But then the episode ends with the aliens kind of watching from their ship from afar. And they say, all the world is full of maple streets. We'll let them destroy themselves. And so this kind of destructive force that we all have within us, as you said, that panicked moment of wanting to survive and wanting to protect you and your family. And in doing that, how quickly you will turn on people that were once allies is a little bit terrifying.
Terrifying, but I mean, isn't that also sort of the thing that came up in our series on the apocalypse? That, I mean, that's one of our big fears of the apocalypse is not the wasteland, but the survivors, and how quickly civilization falls apart once we lose some of these trappings and conveniences. You know, we're still animals in suits, basically. So, you know, you take away our power, you take away our sense of being human or whatever, you know, this civilization, and pretty quickly it seems like, at least in all the post-apocalyptic movies and books and TV shows and stuff, people turn pretty quickly on each other, and it becomes, you know, me and my group, and we're the only ones that I care about surviving, and we don't like outsiders, and yeah, we turn on each other pretty quickly.
Yeah, it is a really common theme. I think that's why this kind of has a timeless feel to it, even though it is very much a product of its time, which this episode premiered on March 4th, 1960. So, and it feels like something that would come out of that era, because a lot of those, speaking of those post-apocalyptic novels that we talked about, the earlier ones were right around, 59, 60. So this fits with all that, but it does have that timeless feel, which is interesting because in doing research for this, I don't know if you guys remember that there was a revival of the Twilight Zone series in like the early 2000s with Forrest Whitaker as the host, kind of taking Rod Serling's role. And they actually redid this episode and set it in, I guess, a more contemporary time to us. And it took place in kind of like one of those neighborhoods that very much has a homeowners association, and everybody's worried about, what the neighbors are doing. And so there's that kind of paranoia. And anyway, it stars Andrew McCarthy, and surprisingly, it did not hold up as well as I thought it would. For being as timeless of a tale, I would like to see somebody else try to redo it, because I don't think that 2003 version was worth anything. So, but just a little bit of, I guess, trivia to throw out. I don't know. Did any of y'all see that?
I did not even know that they revived the Twilight Zone in the early 2000s, but it sounds to me like, I mean, maybe it's just a case of having subpar writing. I mean, when you've got decent acting and a good story, maybe it was just not written very well, and so it didn't hold up that way, because I think we've seen a lot of this. So, I mean, I'm thinking of, you've got this witch hunt sort of story, if anybody remembers that short-lived TV show Jericho that was about the town isolated after a nuclear war breaks out, and it's very similar themes, and that show was really good. It kind of was canceled a bit prematurely, in my opinion. I mean, it made it 2 seasons, but so I mean, thematically, I think, like you said, it is a fairly timeless sort of idea that can be played with just with whatever's the current fear. So maybe the Twilight Zone revival just wasn't good writing?
Well, I think they tried, and going back and watching a few of these episodes from the new one, just out of curiosity, I think they tried too hard to stick as close as they could to the original brand and not, as you said, just take the theme and run with it. Because I think if you look at something like Black Mirror, which kind of does the same thing as the Twilight Zone as far as being an anthology series, and it takes what we are paranoid about and exploits it. And I think that is probably a much closer cousin to the original than even this 2003 Twilight Zone was. So yeah, I think there is something to that, something to the writing. You can't just take something and expect it to work without making some significant changes when you've got an audience that is so different, because a 2017 or 2018 audience is very different from a 1960 audience. They're expecting different things. And so I think you're making a good point there, where you take the theme and you update it and you change it. Jericho is a really good example, because I agree with you. That was a good show that deals with a lot of the same issues and themes and did it really well.
It's talking about the timeless aspect of it, though, and I agree with what you guys are saying, and with Jericho. I've actually used this episode in teaching before, and I mean the first time I used it, which was a few years ago, and I was using it in a upper level course, went over way better than maybe later uses of it. But I was teaching Shirley Jackson's The Lottery and The Summer People, and so they had read those stories, and then they came to class and we watched The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, and the students at first were like, "Oh, this is black and white, this is old," and when it ended, the room was silent. And they were really disturbed by it, and they were impressed at it. Yeah, I mean, it was interesting to me because it still got them, even though they were kind of resistant at first. So, yeah, there is something about the story, and I don't know if it's, I hate to put it this way because I would like to have more faith in humanity, but maybe it's the simplicity of it. And the fact that we could see it happening, that it doesn't necessarily matter if the technology isn't updated. You know what I mean? Like, it's this is simple human relationships that maybe still get people.
Yeah, I mean, it resonates. It still resonates. And I think I'd like to watch it because probably like you two, I've seen this episode before. And so I knew what was coming. But I'd like to watch it with somebody who had never seen it, because there are some pretty good twists and turns in this episode if you don't know where it's coming. Just the very first one is just the title alone with playing with the idea of who the monster is. But then there are still twists as to, who they're going to attack and of course the ending and how quickly the violence escalates, because it's 30 minutes? And it starts off with, as you said, this kind of idyllic scene where you have laughing kids, and there's even an ice cream man pushing this cart around. And, people are walking around with their ice cream cones, and there's mention of barbecues on every lawn. And, it just seems so, and people seem to really get along and like each other. And then by the end, I mean, you've got people who are dead and screaming and running for their lives. And yeah, I'd kind of like to see it with a group of people who didn't know what was coming. Yeah, but speaking of watching this thing for the first time, I sat down yesterday to rewatch some of these episodes, and I watched Time Enough at Last, which is the one, Matt, I think you suggested, which is one of my other favorites, and I'm so glad that I got to rewatch it. But I actually rewatched it with my son, and it was his first foray into the Twilight Zone, and now he's hooked. But he sat down, and I figured this was a good one because it wasn't too terribly scary. Some of them have some monsters and some pretty hideous looking makeup and that sort of thing. And I didn't want to scare him too badly, considering I'd be the one getting up with him in the middle of the night when he had nightmares. But we started Time Enough at Last, and it was kind of fun watching it with him because, again, it was an episode that I have seen so many times that I almost took it for granted. But watching him watch it, it was like, he was watching some big epic adventure. And I forgot how exciting it is to see some of the things that happen in that episode, I guess, kind of through new eyes. And it fits with what we've been talking about, the whole post-apocalyptic. And of course, this one was 1959. So again, right in the same kind of fear of the H-bomb and the A-bomb. And this is the one, if you don't remember, where the bank manager just desperately wants to read his books. And he is the sole survivor of a cataclysmic bomb event. I don't know. I'm curious to hear your thoughts before I jump into mine.
Well, part of the reason why I chose this one is, I mean, yes, it's an iconic episode. It's one of those ones that everybody who's seen it remembers and sticks with them. But part of the other reason is that there is a lot of kindred spirit between me and the character played by Burgess Meredith. I'm drawing a blank on his name, but
Henry Bemis.
Henry Bemis.
Bemis,
yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Henry Bemis. Yes, I mean I have definitely. I am a reader much like him, and the scene where, because he works in the bank, he's a bank teller, and he's trying to describe David Copperfield, which he's reading while making change to a woman, and the bank manager comes up and he fires him essentially by saying, "You're a reader," and there's just this the way that he puts the emphasis on that word just made me want to slap him, because I'm like, well, there's nothing wrong with that, but this is the kid who would be reading a book on the bus on the way to and from school. Not a school-related book, but something that was, completely unrelated. That's me. So I totally feel that kinship with him. And there have definitely been times in my life where I'm like, I just want nobody to be around, at least until I finish reading this book, because, when you're married and have kids and pets and life, sometimes there are interruptions. But, well, I mean, I guess we should jump to the ending as well, too, because that's that great Twilight Zone twist moment. I mean, you think the twist is that he's the last man alive after this nuclear apocalypse, after the H-bomb drops and he happened to be hiding out in the bank vault to finish his novel. But no, the real Twilight Zone moment is at the end, where he discovers, like, he wants to kill himself because he's alone and desperately lonely, until he discovers the public library and finds all of his books and organizes them by the months and years in which he's going to read them, and then he breaks his glasses.
It is one of the most painful moments in TV history.
It is so cruel, because, I mean, and I mean, I definitely, like I said, I feel this kinship with him in the sense of, I mean, not that I want to be the sole survivor in a nuclear wasteland just so I can read all day long. It's not that, but like, I've definitely, I get that. I want to read uninterrupted sometimes. Probably not to the extent that he does, and I certainly do not have the horrifically mismatched wife that he has, who just...
When she rips the book up in front of him, it's just horrifying.
It is.
She is a mean woman, and you can understand why he doesn't grieve the loss of anyone. He worries about being alone at one point, but when you look at like his customers and the bank manager and his wife, yeah, I mean, I would prefer to be alone too.
Right? Like, he's basically, I mean, I wouldn't say he's been bullied by everyone, but he's definitely been pushed around by everyone. I mean, his wife definitely is a bully, but yeah, I mean, he's been obviously pushed around his whole life, and you can tell that the only reason he's really working in this bank anyway is because of his wife. Like, I don't know what the reasoning, they don't go into the backstory there, but you can tell that he's not really happy in this job, or else he wouldn't be reading constantly, right? If he was truly invested in his job and cared about it enough, he would be doing a decent job. And so I get the feeling like she probably forced him to do that because it makes better money than, working in the library or whatever he wants to do. But yeah, it's cruel. It's such a cruel thing to have happen to him with the broken glasses. Like, when they fall and you hear them crack, you're like, oh, and then he picks them up and the rest of the lenses just sort of fall out, and it's like, oh man, oh, it's horrible.
Well, the only thing that makes me feel even a little bit better about the ending of that is considering how easily he found food and cigarettes, and then how quickly he found the library with the books undamaged. He is going to probably by the next day find an optometrist that has somehow his supply of glasses have survived. So I have hope that he will find a pair of glasses and be able to return to the library pile.
He'll find a LensCrafters.
That's right.
He'll be all right.
Just because the food and the cigarettes were found so easily.
Right, and they're going to last forever. I think he vastly overestimated the amount of time he had for that food.
Yeah.
But he's a reader. Reading saved his life, though. If he hadn't been hiding to read, he would have died with everybody else.
Well, this struck me this time, and I'm so glad that you said that, because beyond just one of the most painful endings of all television history, this is such a good metaphor for the kind of artistic and creative spirit, because you have the bank manager and even the customer who is listening to the rant about David Copperfield, and she's just angry because he shortchanged her $1. And the wife, of course, everybody wants him to be more efficient. That's the bank manager's big thing is, you're not doing your job. You're not being efficient. Books aren't efficient. Art, sitting down to enjoy art is never going to be efficient. It's never going to bring in money. It's never going to help you, quote unquote, live in the world. And all of the characters that surround him kind of fit that bill of, you've got to be out there. You've got to be efficient. You've got to be making money. You've got to be doing your job. And in the end, they all die. And as you said, Mel, books are the one thing that helped him to survive, because that was the whole reason he was in the bank vault to begin with. And I think that's such a wonderful metaphor for people who do love to read or who do enjoy art, because it's never going to be efficient. Sitting down to read a book is never going to solve the world's problems. It's never going to bring in a lot of money. It's never going to wow your friends at a dinner party, which is the whole reason she destroys that book of poetry, the wife does, because he's trying to smuggle it into dinner with friends. And, it's never going to be that thing that makes sense in like a capitalist world. But there's still that joy there, and he understands that. And so I do think it's lovely that is what ends up triumphing in the end, up until the last, 30 seconds. Anyway.
But we hold hope that he'll find some lenses.
Go ahead.
Oh, I thought the touch of having him holding the newspaper with the warning about the possibility of destruction by the H-bomb when it happens was an interesting touch, because we like to think that that's like the Twilight Zone aspect of it, right? Like the end of the world. But sadly, that's an everyday reality then and possibly now with all the news that's going on. And the Twilight Zone aspect of it is the way that he's being treated. And then the twist at the end, the normal fabric of every day is him seeing that headline. I thought the way that was just slipped in was perfect.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like the way they dealt with technology too, because there was that one detail that I had forgotten about, which is when he stumbles out of the vault and he finds the hand that has the tape recorder basically in it. And I guess that's supposed to be one of his colleagues, I guess, listening to some sort of it sounded like a motivational thing on tape almost of, kind of along the lines of, this is what you have to do to get ahead in the world, which I don't know, kind of fits in with that whole idea of reading is never going to get you ahead. And that's why so many people were against him, because he was content just to sit and read. And I did like the detail that he had the gun to his head until he saw the words public library. That was a nice, it may feel a little heavy-handed, but that was a nice touch.
Okay, at the risk of cutting off our discussion on Mr. Henry Bemis and the powers of the public library, which I wholeheartedly support, I know we have another episode that we want to discuss, and that was the one that you said you really enjoyed, Lisa, and you want us to talk about, The Masks, which I actually watched for the first time last night and getting ready for this discussion. You want to talk to us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so I will confess something. This was the first time I had watched this episode as well. When I was thinking about my favorites, of course, we've already talked about two of my favorites, with The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street and Time Enough at Last. And then I almost did the one, which I'm blanking on the name right now, but with the monster on the wing of the airplane, because that's kind of a classic. And then I thought, you know what? No, I want to pick something that I have never seen before and that I can watch just completely new and fresh. And so that's why I picked The Masks. And I actually picked this one because the sci-fi marathon that Matt mentioned at the beginning of the episode that kind of inspired our rewatch of some of these, they're airing this one so that it ends at midnight Eastern time. And so I thought, well, that sounds kind of festive. So I wanted to see what it was about. And it actually, midnight is an important time in the TV show, in the episode itself. But it's basically about an old man named Jason Foster, and he's very wealthy. He's dying alone, kind of a common trope of he's dying alone in his house, and his family is waiting for him to die because they want to know who inherits this vast wealth that he has. And so he invites them all and wants to have kind of a final party at his home that they have to attend. And that's the premise of the episode. And I've heard of this type of thing before. I'm sure you guys have seen it as well. One thing I did not realize is that it was actually a Mardi Gras party, and it's set in New Orleans, which is kind of fun considering I live about an hour outside of the French Quarter. So I felt a kinship, I guess, with some of the festivities going on. But this is a really interesting episode because there are shades of Edgar Allan Poe throughout this, and there's definitely like a Vincent Price feel to it. Kind of, what's the Vincent Price movie where he invited everyone to his house?
Oh, The House on Haunted Hill.
Right. It kind of had that feel to it. But one thing I found interesting was that he was trying to stay alive until midnight. And he was very adamant in asking his doctor at the beginning of the episode, will I be alive until midnight? Because he wanted to, I guess, see how his plan would play out. And it involved his rather horrible family members putting on these masks and wearing them until midnight. So since you, Mel, and Matt, I'm assuming too, watched it for the first time, I'm curious to know what you thought about this.
I liked it. I did. It wasn't what I was expecting, that's for sure. And I had not seen it before either, before today, in fact, when I was getting ready for this episode. And so I did find it interesting. I feel like I'm trying to dance around spoilers for a show that's like 50 years old. So you know what? No.
We're going to spoil it for you guys. I'm just going to put that out there.
We've already done that with the other two episodes. I don't know why I'm dancing around it with this one. I felt like at the beginning when they're introducing the family, the greedy vultures who have swept into town to feast off the estate of this guy, they really did feel like very one-dimensional. You've got the daughter who is the hypochondriac and melodramatic, the son who is nothing but nothing but greed and cares only about money, the granddaughter that's vain and always looking in the mirror, and then the grandson that's, for lack of a better word, Dexter. Like he describes him as killing animals and when he was a kid. So like, a serial killer in training. But like they all felt very heavy-handed at the beginning. And I was wondering about that. But then by the end, when the big reveal with the masks, when they're putting them on, or I think it's before they take them off. Either way, kind of when the patriarch talks about how each one of them is basically just a caricature. And I was like, yes, they are. But I mean, there are people that are just like that. There are people that live for nothing more than money, or people that are nothing but narcissists. And while they may have been written very two-dimensionally, that was also a little bit of the point of the episode. So what started out as heavy-handed, I thought, ended up working well when you get to the end.
Oh, I completely agree. And I think that's why I compared it to like an Edgar Allan Poe story, because, when you think about something like The Mask of the Red Death, the symbolism can seem very heavy-handed at times, and yet it works for the story, and it works in Poe's case because he's a very capable writer, and in this case because Rod Serling knew what he was doing when he crafted these stories. And I agree with you. They're one-dimensional. They are caricatures. There's no redeeming qualities about any of them. They are horrible people, and they're presented as horrible people who kind of get what's coming to them in the end. But that also kind of fits the whole carnival feel, and having it set against a Mardi Gras setting, and not necessarily just like this could have been a New Year's Eve party, for instance, the clock striking at midnight, or it could have just been a party, as they called it several times, a death watch. But to have it set against Mardi Gras and this idea of atoning for sins and the wearing of masks and kind of hiding who you truly are, or in their case, not hiding who they truly are. I think their problem was they didn't see themselves as who they were. The audience could, and of course the old man who was dying could see them for who they are, but they couldn't. The they saw themselves as just normal, good people. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting spin on things too.
Yeah, I felt like it was very much, just like you said, Lisa, Poe, Mask of the Red Death, Poe-esque there, with this kind of allegorical, almost, the only thing I can think of to describe is like morality play, maybe, just showing us types and kind of playing with that. But then I do think there's that deeper aspect of who we think we are versus who we really are. And this idea of this topsy-turvy carnival time, almost like a Cask of Amontillado type thing, where all these kind of strange things can happen or be revealed. And I thought the use of the mirror was kind of masterful in it, because at the very beginning I was like, oh, cool shot, showing the dying man in the mirror. But then I realized like every character had this like mirror moment throughout until they all see who they really are at the end. And so that idea of like reflection and coming to terms with who you really are rather than hiding it inside. Even the psychopath kid who looked like he was older than his dad.
Didn't he though? That confused me for half the episode.
I thought the same thing. They mentioned him like being in school and just making the football team, and I'm like, what, the middle-aged football team? Like
he looks 45.
Like his hairline is receding as quickly as his dad's.
Some unfortunate genes. Maybe because he's evil, it aged him earlier. I don't know, but
I mean, I don't know. Dexter stayed pretty young and strapping looking. Like you'd think this one would too, but
well, didn't Dexter use some of his powers for good? So
that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, there are mirror shots in this. I mean, again, and we've said this with other episodes, but this is what sets apart the original Twilight Zone from other things that have been attempted in a similar theme, is that if you take something that could easily be a cliched storyline, and with anybody else you'd be rolling your eyes and, changing the channel to something else. And the Twilight Zone does it so well because the writing is so tight, and the way it's directed and kind of the artistry, I guess, behind it is so good that you can overlook some of the things. And again, kind of as you said, Matt, you see that if somebody is being presented as one-dimensional, then that's intentional. It's not just lazy writing. It's part of the story, and it's part of what's going on. And Mel, I think the way you described it as a morality play is a really good descriptor of it. Although I will say, I thought it was funny when he put out the mask and he kind of told his family what was happening. He said, you're going to wear these until midnight, and if you don't, you're not going to get any of my money. So, of course, they're going to play along. But he said, these were made by an old Cajun. And that was all the backstory you needed. It was like, oh, of course, they were made by an old Cajun. So we know they must have some magical, mystical properties to them. I'm surprised the word voodoo was never thrown out. But maybe that was too much for 1964's audience. So Old Cajun was all that was needed to give all the backstory for the masks, which was kind of nice shorthand, I thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he just said something like they have a special quality to them or something like that.
Certain properties is what he said, yeah. They were made by an old Cajun, and they have certain properties. And that was all you got about them. But that was enough to know that, oh, there's something special about these masks. And, of course, they would transform their faces to show who they really were. But
and the older guy was who he was, right? Because his face didn't change.
Well,
right.
His face did change because he wore the mask that was death, which was the thing that was stalking him. And at midnight, he died. So, well,
that's true.
What I was going to say was what I found interesting was the way that he led them to putting on the masks was by saying that you're supposed to put on the mask that is the opposite of what you are. And so to the greedy son, he's like, oh, well, describe yourself. And he's like, oh, I'm affable. And so he kind of leads him along as like, oh, so you're extroverted, you're friendly, you're, generally care about humanity. So like you as the viewer realize, oh, no, him putting on the mask is actually what he really is. It's just an external representation of his internal self, but he believes that it's his opposite self, that he really is this good, kind, caring person. And the granddaughter really isn't vain and self-involved and all of that. etc. I mean, I liked that. I thought it was a great little lead, like the way he led them to that. Like, oh, so, you're clearly, kind and caring and giving, and so that's why you're going to wear this. When in fact, of course you're not. You're, a selfish jerk. But
well, and earlier there was that great line where he had said, "I think if I cut you open, a cash register would fall out."
Yes.
Yes, that was a good one.
And speaking of that, because he did wear there was one mask that was sculpted to look like a skull, and that was Death, and that was the one that the Jason Foster put on, and he even said that, as you said, Matt, that Death was the thing that was chasing him, but it was the opposite of who he was, because at the moment he was alive, even though he didn't intend to stay that way. And I thought there was a nice little moment at the end where when the doctor does take off his mask and you see that his face isn't transformed, but they have that little kind of micro speech about, well, this is what death is. Death is just peaceful and death is calm. And you kind of got the sense that he did escape something because he had this horrible family. And the only character I feel like that you really felt for was the dying man, even though he was incredibly manipulative. And his daughter constantly made references to, "You always play games with us." So, this wasn't the first time that he'd done something along these lines and kind of made them do something in order to say, "You want my money, you do this." So he wasn't entirely sympathetic, but you did feel like he was escaping something and kind of finding that peace in the end. And I liked those few lines, I guess, from the doctor at the end talking about what death was, because it was a lot nicer, I think, than what the other characters got.
Yeah, and he accepted who he was at the end, I think, warts and all, whereas they were just completely delusional.
Completely.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like at the end, whether he was a good guy or not, and I think there is some evidence that maybe part of how they, especially the daughter, became who they were is maybe because of how he was as a father. He seemed, just like you were saying, Lisa, they're completely delusional. Like, even in the end, they're almost shocked by what they've become. Like, he did something to them, as opposed to they were really like that. But he faces the end with some sort of calmness, I guess. And I also really enjoyed the doctor's speech at the end. I thought it tied it up really nicely in a way that wasn't trite. But listeners, we have come to the end of our time in the Twilight Zone. We hope you enjoyed this episode. It's kind of outside our normal themed episodes that we do. We very much enjoyed the episodes that we've done for you in 2017, and we are looking forward to what we're going to be doing in 2018. We hope you had a happy new year, and you continue to, and we thank you so much for listening, and we will talk to you next time.